Hey everybody, welcome back to another new episode of Discovering Art Together. My name is Victoria and today we are going to learn and discover how to paint silk like the old masters. So today's episode we're going to take a deeper dive into one of my favorite artists from the Golden Dutch Age, and his name is Gerard ter Borch, or ter Borch. I can't remember how you're supposed to pronounce it though, but he is a great master of genre painting back in the 17th century of the Golden Dutch Age, and also he is a master of painting beautiful clothing texture, especially silk. And that's one of the main things I love about this artist, is that he does a really great execution and also rendering this very magical and very meticulous material. So, if you guys are ready, let's get started. So the first question that we want to ask ourselves is, what makes it look like silk? So we have three main things that we want to keep in mind when we want to be able to paint silk. The first thing is the lighting. So lighting works very differently depending on what kind of material it is, because light would reflect on that surface and bounce back to us, into your eyes, and it will look very different. The second thing we want to make sure is that the shape of the tones, the value tones, the colors, and the shadows. So basically that tells us how the light works, and also tells us how the folds of the silk texture works on the clothing. And the other main important part is noticing where we see the soft and hard edges, because that makes a really big difference, because silk is a very it's a very smooth, and the light reflects onto it quite easily. So we have certain areas with super strong highlights, and then there are other areas where we see dips and folds where we have more color and more shadow. So now that we know the three main things to keep in mind while looking at how to create a silky texture, we're going to go ahead and take a look at this painting that we're going to study today, which is by Gerard ter Borch, and it is called The Letter. We're going to look at two different types of silk, or also two different colors of silk, so we can kind of take a look and see how the colors would differ between one another and how the light works and kind of expresses that silky texture that we see. So if we do take a look at the blue part over here, we see that the folds are very different, just because depending on where it is and which part of the clothing it is, the way you sew and kind of make the dress, the folds would look definitely a lot more different. So with the blue part, as you can see here, the places where there's a lot more fabric and texture of the silk, you see that there's these really huge dips on the shoulder area of the dress, and that creates a good chance for the light to kind of bounce in and create a really strong, bright highlight. Since the light is more or less coming from the top right side of this painting, so a lot of the brighter areas are going to be there. The other thing that you did notice, that the darker shadows is actually really close to where the super bright highlights are, just because it creates a really strong contrast, because silk has a somewhat reflective surface, so the shine on that silky texture creates that really strong contrast. But at the same time, as you can see, the top part, the very top part of the dress over here, there is a very soft transition. So we have a soft edge that's working around this top part, so it's like right above the shoulder. And we also do have something similar on the back side of her dress, but that one has a hard border because that's the back, and then the other part is just the sleeve of her right hand. So it's two separate parts, so that's why we see a sharper edge compared to the top area that I just mentioned above the shoulder. The other things that the folds work differently, we kind of see how the seams and the texture are working though, but there is a lot of areas where we have a lot of soft edges and certain areas that has the super sharp edges. So keeping that in mind while you paint this silky texture makes a really big difference. So that's that. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the white silk, which is the bottom part of the white dress. So as you can see with this one, it works a little bit differently from the blue silk that we see at the top. This part of the dress seems a lot more rigid. So the top part seemed a little bit softer texture, but this bottom part seems a lot, like the silk seems a lot thicker, and it kind of keeps its form a little bit more. So as you can see, when the folds bend in a certain way, we have these really sharp folds and creating contrast, and then the light bounces a lot and having a lot of reflection on the places where it could catch the direct light from the top right side of this painting. And same goes for this one. We do see a lot of soft edges blending in into the clothing, and certain areas, the sharp areas, are more or less the edge of the fold. So it's not something that's within the folds because silk is a very soft texture. And we're gonna actually go ahead and take an example of actually looking at some reference of actual white silk. So this silk definitely is very different from what we see on the dress in the painting because, as you can see, it's not as rigid, so it's a lot softer. So you see more curved lines instead of sharper angles and all that stuff. If we have another example over here of this white silk, it's the same thing. So you can feel that it's a softer texture just because when light falls on certain types of textures and materials, it would bounce back the light in a very different way. So this is would be considered a softer silk than the one that we see in the painting. So the painting, the dress looks a lot more thicker, more rigid, probably a little bit more heavier, just to see like all the big folds in the dress. So that's one main key point though. And definitely the contrast is also very strong too, because you can see a lot of the really bright highlights in contrast to the dark shadows and the folds within the dress. And that's it for today. So that's pretty much my analysis and discovery of how to paint silk like the old masters. Feel free to kind of try out and keep in mind those steps and advice while you're painting those. So make sure that you have the correct placement for the lighting. So making sure that the shadows are the right place and the highlights and shine are at the correct place as well. And then keep in mind of the shape of the shadow, because that would tell you how the folds work, and also keeping an eye out for the shape of the valley tones and then the colors, so that we kind of know how this silk texture or this clothing is positioned and also placed. And the last thing is definitely soft edge and hard edge. That's probably one of the most important part, because silk comes and goes and it bends light as it pleases, because light always travels straight though, but when it kind of hits the texture and the fabric of the silk is really glossy and shiny at certain places, but it suddenly blends in, fades into this really dark, deep shadow and color tone. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this brand new episode of how to paint silk like the old masters, and here is a mini exercise for you guys. So you can either paint one of Gerard Borch's paintings of a silky dress. It doesn't have to be this particular painting that we saw today. You can pick other ones. He has a few different ones, and you don't have to paint the whole thing. You can if you want to, but you can paint a certain area so that you kind of get a better understanding of how silk works. Or you can also find actual silk texture. You can always just Google it or find it on Pinterest. Just find a silky texture and just kind of see if you can actually recreate and also paint what you see. So getting to understand how the light works on this texture, and it will be super helpful for you. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks again for tuning in for a brand new episode of Discovering Art Together, and looking forward to sharing more art tips and advices with you, and also sharing new discoveries and just continuing learning and expanding our knowledge in art, painting, and drawing, and so much more. Okay, and I shall catch you guys next time. Wishing you a wonderful week and Happy New Year! I'll see you next year. Take care, guys. Bye. Thank you.